Let me tell you something about the Vethkari. Not the sanitized version they put in the galactic species catalogs. Not the diplomatic footnote buried in the Interstellar Accord of 2289. I mean the real version. The one that makes even the Dreth warlords, those 8-foot armored lizard soldiers who once glassed an entire moon just to settle a trade dispute. I mean those guys, the ones who collect skulls as currency. I mean the version that makes them go quiet when someone mentions the name. The Vethkari are the apex predators of the outer spiral. That's not a title. That's not a ranking on some galactic leaderboard. It's a biological fact. It's a geological fact. It's a fact written in the bones of 47 species across 6 star systems that no longer exist in any significant number because one Vethkari decided, at some point in history, that a particular planet smelled interesting. They are 12 feet tall when they unfold fully. Their skin shifts, not like a chameleon, not like the color shift tech you've seen in the cheaper combat suits. It shifts in ways that confuse the optical nerve directly. Your brain stops registering them. They become part of the landscape. They are patient in a way that geological time would respect. They have been recorded waiting motionless in one position for 42 standard days before striking. They do not sleep. They do not feel cold. They have been documented surviving in the vacuum of space for periods measured in hours. And they do not bond with anything. Not with their own young. Not with their hunting partners, not with the environments they have occupied for centuries. The closest behavioral scientists have ever gotten to describing a Vethkari social structure is this: solitary apex predators that occasionally tolerate proximity to other Vethkari for reproductive purposes, and even then, only briefly. No bonds, no attachments, no chosen companions. No exceptions. Until Mara Callahan of Billings, Montana, age 19, walked off a transit shuttle at Waystation Quelly's 7 with a broken duffel bag, 42 credits to her name, and absolutely no idea what anything around her was. And everything we thought we knew about the Vethkari had to get thrown out the window. I know because I was there. I saw it begin. I watched it unfold over 11 days. I was still there when the army came. And I will tell you every single thing that happened, exactly as it happened, because someone needs to have this on record before the official version buries all the parts that actually matter. Quelly's 7 is not the kind of place you end up by accident. Except that's exactly how most humans end up there, by accident. It sits at the gravitational junction of 3 shipping lanes, the outer hall, the Meridian Run, and a smaller tributary route called the Dust Thread that mostly handles resource transport from the mining settlements on Quelly's 4 and Quelly's 5. Transit vessels pass through the junction constantly, and the Waystation exists to service them. Fuel depots, maintenance bays, a medical quarter, a transit processing hub where connecting passengers wait for their next vessel. And around all of that, like barnacles on the hull of something much larger, the commercial district. Roughly 800 permanent residents operating shops, service stations, food stalls, legal services, biological services, and a handful of establishments that I will describe simply as complex in their nature and leave it there. It is loud. It is crowded. It smells like 6 different atmospheres competing for dominance in a shared ventilation system. The lighting is calibrated for 7 different visual spectrums simultaneously, which means if you've got standard human eyes, about 30% of what you're looking at appears to be flickering at all times, and the remaining 70% has a slight purple tint that never quite goes away. I have been working at Quelly's 7 for 6 standard years. I run a documentation and translation service in the commercial district, passage contracts, transit manifests, customs declarations, that kind of work. Nothing glamorous, but it pays, and I've built a decent life here, and I know this station the way you know a place when you've lived it long enough that the noise becomes background and the strangeness becomes ordinary. I know, for instance, which corridors to avoid when the Dreth cargo crews rotate through. I know which food vendors actually calibrate their atmospheric dispensers correctly for human biology, and which ones will give you a week of intestinal chaos because they forgot to adjust the spore content. I know the maintenance schedule for the east docking ring well enough to know when the pressure differentials get dangerous near the junction corridors. And I know where the Vethkari goes. His name, or rather, the name he permits to be recorded in the station's species registry, is Vel. Just Vel. Vethkari don't do multiple names. The station registry has him listed as a Vethkari adult male, solitary status, permanent resident, occupation, unspecified. He's been on the station for 9 standard years. He occupies a suite in the outer ring that he has modified extensively. The temperature runs lower, the lighting is stripped out entirely, and the pressure is higher than standard. The station authority let him make the modifications after he made 3 separate station security personnel briefly regret their career choices during a dispute about unauthorized structural alterations. The dispute was resolved in Vel's favor, quickly. He moves through the station on a loose schedule. Not predictable, Vethkari don't do predictable, but loose enough that if you pay attention, you know he passes through certain corridors at certain times. The commercial district clears for him automatically, not because there's a rule, because every species on this station has a deep biological program that fires when something apex level walks into the room, and that program says, move, just move, get out of the trajectory, do not make eye contact. Do not present yourself as relevant to whatever this is. Most species comply with that program immediately and completely. Humans, unfortunately, comply with it about 60% of the time. The other 40% stand there with their mouths open. Chapter 3. The Girl Who Came Off the Wrong Shuttle. The transit shuttle from Meridian Station 12 arrived at Quellis 7 on what the station calendar calls a 7th cycle morning, which means the artificial lighting was in its low amber shift, and the commercial district was at about 40% of peak foot traffic. I was at my station, a corner unit in the main transit hub, glass front, good sightlines to the arrival gates, processing a stack of cargo manifests for a Quellis 5 mining operation when the Meridian 12 shuttle passengers started coming through. I noticed her because of the bag. It was a human duffel, canvas, dark green, with a zipper that had clearly failed on one side and been replaced with a length of something that might have been paracord or might have been repurposed cargo wire. The bag was straining. She had it over one shoulder and she was compensating for its weight with every step, leaning slightly, and she was also pulling a smaller bag on her other arm, and she was looking at everything around her with an expression I can only describe as someone who has decided not to panic, but is having to work at it continuously. Human, young, I put her in the late teen range, which turned out to be accurate. Dark hair pulled back in a rough braid with strands coming loose everywhere. Work clothes, not travel clothes, not station clothes, the kind of sturdy, practical clothing someone wears when they expect to be doing physical labor. Boots that had seen significant use. She came through the gate and stopped. Not gradually, she just stopped, because the transit hub of Quellis 7 in amber shift, at 40% traffic, is still a large, loud, visually complicated space full of beings representing approximately 40 distinct sapient species, and the sensory load of it apparently hit her all at once. She stood there for a moment with her broken bag and her work clothes, and she looked around at all of it, and her face did this thing where you could see the internal calculation happening in real time. The "this is a lot" calculation. The eye was not fully prepared for this calculation. Then she straightened up, adjusted the bag on her shoulder, and walked toward the information terminal, which, unfortunately, was the one that had been experiencing software issues for 3 days, and was displaying everything in Quellic script, regardless of the language setting you selected. I watched her stare at the terminal for a moment. I watched her tap it several times. I watched her turn and look for a station staff member, of which there were none visible in that section at that moment because it was shift change. Then she looked around, spotted my booth, which has a sign in 17 languages, Human Standard being one of them, and walked over. "Excuse me," she said. "Hi, sorry to bother you. Do you work here?" "On the station, yes. Not for the station. I do transit documentation." "Okay." She shifted the bag again. Is there a connecting terminal or something?" "I need to find the work placement office. I'm supposed to be starting a labor contract on Quellies 4. "Quellies 4, I said. "The mining settlement." "Yeah, I have a contract." She pulled a document from the smaller bag, a printed physical document, which is a very human thing to do, and showed it to me. It was legitimate. A standard 6-month labor placement contract with Quellies Mining Cooperative, work category, surface operations support. "You're connecting transport to Quellies 4 leaves from Dock 7, I told her. "But not for," I checked the manifest, "14 hours. She absorbed this, 14 hours. "Yes." She looked around the hub again. "And there's somewhere I can, like, sit and get something to eat, that humans can eat." "Several places. I can draw you a map." "That would be amazing, actually. Thank you. I'm Mara, by the way." "Dren," I said. "I am Quellic. We're a mid-tier species, roughly humanoid, about 4 feet tall, with a bone structure that reads to humans as slightly delicate. We've been in regular contact with humans for about 30 years, and we get along well enough." I drew her a map to the human-compatible food quarter, marked the transit waiting lounge, noted the location of the currency exchange, and told her which corridors to avoid at this time of cycle. She thanked me, folded the map carefully, tucked it in her jacket pocket, and walked off into the station. I watched her go and thought, 14 hours and then she'll be on her way, simple as that. I could not have been more wrong. It happened in the junction corridor between the commercial district and the outer freight section. I heard about it first from Pess, a dreth vendor who runs a mechanical parts stall near the corridor entrance, and who has remarkably good audio pickup for someone who looks like they were assembled from tank components. Pess told me about it about 2 hours after it happened, in the slow, slightly stunned way that people describe things they are still processing. Mara had gone exploring. This is, apparently, a thing she does when she has unstructured time. She walks. She's from rural Montana, she told me later, and she grew up in a place where you dealt with open space by moving through it, and her response to a 14-hour wait in an unfamiliar place was to walk around and look at things until she understood where she was. She had found the junction corridor. The junction corridor connects the commercial district to the outer freight section and is not technically a public thoroughfare. It's a transit path for cargo and maintenance, and there are signs indicating as much. The signs are in 12 languages. Human Standard is not one of them, because humans are not supposed to be in the freight section. Mara walked into the junction corridor because the signs didn't mean anything to her, and because the corridor was there, and she was curious. And Vel was in the junction corridor. Nobody knows exactly what Vel was doing there. He uses the freight corridors sometimes, they're wider and less crowded, and he doesn't have to modulate his threat presence as carefully when there are fewer beings around to be affected by it. He may have been transiting between sections. He may have been doing something specific in the freight area. The point is, he was there in the dim junction corridor, in the way that a Vethkari is there, which is to say, occupying the full psychological weight of the space around him, skin slightly shifted so that the ambient light caught his edges in ways that made him look like he was made of shadow and intention. And Mara walked right into him. Not metaphorically, physically. She came around a curve in the corridor, moving quickly with her characteristic forward lean, and she walked directly into approximately 600 pounds of the galaxy's most dangerous predator. Pess, who was at the corridor entrance and had clear sightlines, told me that What happened next was one of the strangest things they had ever witnessed in 9 years on Quelly's 7. Mara bounced off Vel. He didn't move, she did, and stumbled back a step and looked up at him and said, and I am quoting directly from Pess's account, "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. Are you okay? Are you okay?" She asked the Vethkari if he was okay. Pess said. Vel went very still. Not the aggressive stillness, not the pre-strike stillness that everyone on this station has learned to recognize and evacuate away from. A different kind of still, the kind that doesn't have a standard behavioral classification, because there is no recorded instance of a Vethkari going that kind of still. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then Vel made a sound. Pess described it as low and resonant, in the subaudible range that Vethkari use for something between acknowledgement and territorial signal, but without the aggressive harmonic, just the sound. Mara, who cannot hear subaudibles and who has no biological programming related to Vethkari behavioral cues, apparently interpreted this as confirmation that the large creature was fine, said, "Okay, great, sorry again," and walked around him and continued down the corridor toward the freight section. Pess said. Vel turned and watched her go. Just watched her. Pess had never seen Vel track anything with curiosity before. Pray, yes, there's a specific tracking behavior that every species on this station recognizes and responds to by leaving the area immediately. Threat assessment, yes, but this was neither of those things. This was interest. I'm going to tell you what happened next from Mara's own account, because she told me about it that evening when she came back to my booth to ask about currency conversion rates and ended up staying for 2 hours talking. She went into the freight section, which is large, cathedral-ceilinged, full of stacked cargo containers and the mechanical hum of loading equipment, and she spent a while walking around looking at things, the way she does. She looked at the cargo manifests posted on containers and tried to work out the numeral system. She watched the loading equipment operate and tried to figure out the mechanical principles. She found a section of older containers that had atmospheric growth on them, something like moss, but with a faint silver sheen, and she crouched down and looked at it for a long time because she thought it was beautiful. She was looking at the silver growth when she became aware that something was behind her. She said she heard it before she felt it, a low vibration, not quite sound, more like pressure in the air. And she turned around and Vel was there, not 3 feet away, having followed her from the junction corridor in complete silence. He was huge, she told me. Like I knew cognitively that there were large species on the station, I knew that. But knowing it, and having one appear behind you when you're crouched down looking at something, are 2 very different experiences. She stood up slowly. She said she felt something, not fear exactly, or not only fear, something that she described as a full-body attention, the sensation of something very significant being very close. And she looked at him, and he looked at her. I said hi, she told me, and she said it with a slight shrug, like this was the obvious response to the situation. She said hi to the Vethkari. He did not respond with anything she could perceive, but he didn't leave. He stood there, in the way that something very large stands when it is not being threatening, which is different from the way something very large stands when it is. She couldn't have known that distinction, but she felt it somehow. I told him about the moss, she said. I know that sounds crazy, but it seemed rude to just stare at him, and I'd been thinking about the moss, so I just told him that I thought it was beautiful, that I was from a place on Earth that had a lot of biological growth like that, different of course, but something about the color and the texture reminded me of home. She talked to the Vethkari about Montana. For 20 minutes. She told him about the high grasslands, and the way the sky looked at dusk in September, and the particular quality of the wind coming off the Rockies, and what it felt like to be in a place so large and quiet that you could feel the curvature of the planet under you. And Vel stood there, 12 feet of apex predator in a dimly lit freight section, and he listened. At the end of it, she wasn't sure how long she'd been talking. She said she just kept going because the alternative was an awkward silence with a creature the size of a small vehicle, she said. I don't know if you understand any of that, but it was nice to say it. She said Vel made a sound, different from the one in the corridor. Lower, slower, something she felt in her sternum more than heard. Then he turned and left. Smooth and silent, the way the big ones move, and in a few seconds there was nothing where he had been. Mara stood in the freight section alone, looking at the silver moss, and she felt something she could not immediately name. Something that settled in the chest the way a resolved chord settles, complete, but also an ending. She went back to the commercial district and found my booth and asked about currency conversion. Mara did not make her connecting transport to Quelly's 4. This is not because anything dramatic happened, not yet. The transport was delayed by a gravitational anomaly in the Quelly's approach corridor, which bumped the departure by 12 hours, and then the rescheduled departure was bumped again because of a cargo load dispute, and Mara found herself still on Quelly's 7 at the start of the third day, with her contract start date rapidly approaching, and the mining cooperative sending increasingly frustrated communications that the transit hub's public terminal helped her parse. She came back to my booth each day, for help with communications, for translation, for general navigation of the station's systems. I became, de facto, her point of contact in a place where she had no other points of contact. And Vel started appearing in places where Mara was. Not aggressively, not territorially. He would simply be present, at a distance. She would be at the food corridor eating something that passed for human compatible, and Vel would be in the corridor that ran along the food corridor's far wall, not doing anything specific, just occupying the space. She would be at the commercial district's observation deck, watching the ships come and go through the large viewport, and Vel would be at the far end of the deck. Not hovering, not staring, present. The first time she noticed it consciously. She told me this on the third day. She had been startled, and then she had thought about it for a moment, and then she had waved. She waved at him. He had gone still for a moment. Then he had made a small movement with one of his secondary appendages. Vethkari have 4 primary limbs and 2 secondary ones, folded and not always visible, that she had interpreted as a response of some kind. An acknowledgement. After that she started talking to him when he was nearby. Not necessarily to him, not directed at him, not expecting a response, more like the way you might talk to a cat that has decided to sit on the same porch as you. Just narrating. What she was looking at, what she was thinking, what she was noticing about the station. And Vel listened, every time. I asked her on the 4th day whether it frightened her. That something like Vel was tracking her movements. She thought about this. No, she said, not really. I know that's probably the wrong answer, but it doesn't feel like how you feel when something dangerous is watching you. I've been in the mountains. I've had that feeling, the feeling that something with teeth is somewhere nearby and you're in its calculation. This isn't that. She paused. This feels more like company. Like something very big decided it was okay for me to exist near it. She laughed a little, like she knew how that sounded. I didn't laugh, because I had been on the station for 6 years, and in 6 years I had never seen anything anywhere near Vel's trajectory change because of another being's presence. He navigated around beings the way weather navigates around mountains, consistently, impersonally, without acknowledgement. Something had shifted. Something in the behavioral architecture of a species that behavioral scientists had studied for 2 centuries without observing a single social bond. And it had shifted because a 19-year-old girl from Montana had walked into him in a corridor and asked if he was okay. On the 5th day, something happened that I need to describe carefully because I do not want to overstate it, and I do not want to understate it. Mara was in the main transit lounge, a large waiting space with seating calibrated for multiple body types and a viewport running the full length of the outer wall. She had her contract documents spread on a table, and she was going through them, trying to understand the detailed clauses, and she had her battered notebook out. She kept a paper notebook, which I found both anachronistic and entirely consistent with everything else about her, and she was making notes. Vel came into the transit lounge. This is notable because Vel does not, as a general rule, occupy public waiting spaces. They are too crowded, too unpredictable in terms of movement patterns, and the acoustics are wrong for him. He has been in the main transit lounge exactly 3 times in 9 years, and all 3 times were for specific operational reasons. He came in and he moved through the space. The space cleared, because of course it did, and he went to the section of seating nearest to where Mara was sitting at her table. And he sat down. Not in a chair. On the floor, Vethkari don't use standard furniture in the way that something very large settles when it intends to remain. Weight shifting, a low sound, and then stillness. About 8 feet from Mara's table. Mara looked up from her documents. She looked at him, she said, "Hi." Then she looked back at her documents and kept working. About 3 minutes later, I was watching through the lounge's transparent wall. I'll be honest with you, I had started watching because I could not stop watching. Vel did something. He reached out with one primary limb and placed something on the floor between them. It was a small object, dark, irregular, roughly the size of a human fist. Mara noticed it, you couldn't not notice it, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at Vel. He made no movement. She reached out slowly and picked it up. It was a piece of something crystalline, dark blue, almost black, with internal structure that caught the station lighting and fractured it into narrow spectra. Not a common mineral, I checked later. It was from the outer asteroid formations near Quelly's 7 gravity boundary. Vel was known to range out there sometimes in the vacuum, which he can survive for extended periods. He had brought her something from outside the station. Something with specific optical properties. Something beautiful in the way that the silver moss had been beautiful. He had listened when she talked about the moss. He had gone and found something analogous. Mara held it in both hands. She turned it slowly, watching the light move through it. "Thank you," she said, quietly. "The way you say something when you mean it completely." Vel made a sound. The low, settled one. The one that Pes had described and that I was now hearing for the first time directly, and it did something to the base of my skull, not threatening, but enormous somehow, like a frequency that was also a message that predated language by geological eons. I am not a behavioral scientist. I cannot tell you clinically what that sound meant. What I can tell you is what it felt like. It felt like acknowledgement, like a creature that had never needed to acknowledge anything choosing, for the first time, to do so. The other beings in the transit lounge were in various states of frozen immobility, doing their best impressions of objects that were not biologically alive. Nobody moved. Nobody left. Leaving might draw attention. Everyone just waited, with the communal stillness of beings who understood, at a base level, that something unprecedented was happening, and the correct response was to not interfere with it. Mara sat at her table with the crystal in her hands, and Vel sat on the floor 8 feet away, and they occupied the space together in a quiet that felt less like silence, and more like a conversation happening below any register that station sensors could record. I am going to be very careful here, because I want you to understand what happened, and not a dramatic version of it. On the 7th day of Mara's accidental stay at Quelly's 7, her transport had been delayed again, this time by an actual mechanical failure, and the mining cooperative was furious, and Mara was trying to manage the communications while also managing the fact that her money was running very low. Vel did something that has a specific, documented meaning in Vethkari behavior. He marked her space as his territory. Not aggressively, not with any behavior that in isolation would have been alarming, but station security has 3 Dreth officers and 2 Quellic officers, and one of the Dreth, a veteran named Gores who has been here for 11 years, saw what happened and came to find me immediately. What Gores described was this. Vel had been present in the vicinity of Mara's regular location for most of the morning. Then, at one point, he had moved through the corridor outside the commercial district where Mara's path regularly ran, and he had made a specific set of markings. Chemical, low level, the kind of thing that only beings with the relevant biological sensors would even detect along the corridor walls. Gore said he detected them and went cold. Because the markings were not, "This is my hunting territory." They were not, "I am present and dominant here." They were a third category, a category so rare that it appears in the behavioral literature only 4 times in recorded history. The marking said, "This is under my protection." I need you to understand what that means. A Vethkari does not protect things. A Vethkari protects nothing. The species does not have a protection protocol in its behavioral repertoire, not for young, not for mates, not for anything. They are solitary, bonded to nothing, responsible for nothing outside themselves. Vel had laid down protection markers for a human girl from Montana who had been on the station for 7 days. Gore said to me, very quietly, "Dren, this is going to cause problems." He had no idea how right he was. I should explain how quickly news travels in a way station environment. Quelli 7 has a permanent population of 800 and a rotating population, transit passengers, visiting crews, contractors, that varies between 500 and 2,000 at any given time. The permanent population knows everything that happens on the station within about 6 hours. The rotating population knows everything within 12. By the end of the 7th day, everyone on Quelli 7 knew that the Vethkari had claimed a human girl. The reactions were varied. The Quellic residents, my people, were primarily anxious. Not because we feared for Mara's safety, but because we understood the political implications in a way that I don't think Mara herself was equipped to understand yet. A Vethkari claim, even an unprecedented one, even a protective one, carries weight in interstellar law that most beings spend their entire lives never needing to understand. The Dreth on the station, there were about 40, mostly cargo and security, were split. The older ones were very quiet and very watchful in the way that experienced people get watchful when something rare is happening. The younger ones were excited in the agitated way of beings who have been told about something extraordinary all their lives and are now witnessing it. The human residents, there were 11 of us permanent, plus Mara and about 30 transiting, were mostly confused, because human contact with Vethkari is limited enough that most people don't have the biological or cultural context to understand what a claim means. Mara herself found out when I told her. I waited until the 8th day. I felt she needed to know, and I felt I was the most appropriate person to tell her, and I spent a good portion of the 7th night working out how to explain it clearly. I sat down with her at her table in the transit lounge. Vel was not present that morning, which helped, and I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you ask questions." She put down her notebook. "That sounds serious." "It is. But it's not dangerous. Not to you, not right now." I paused. "Vel has placed protection markers for you throughout this section of the station." She looked at me. "What does that mean?" "In Vethkari behavioral terms, it means you are under his claim, his protection. It's an extremely rare behavior. In the documented history of the species, it has occurred 4 times, and in all 4 cases it was toward another Vethkari. This is the first time it has been directed at a member of another species." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, because I talked to him. Because you treated him as a being worth addressing. Because you were not afraid of him. Because you spoke to him about things that were real and important to you. I paused. I don't know exactly what the internal process was. Nobody does, but the outcome is documented and specific. And this causes problems because interstellar law recognizes Vethkari behavioral claims as binding sovereign declarations. A Vethkari claim is legally comparable to a territorial declaration by a recognized government, and the Vethkari collective, which you may not have encountered before, they don't interact with human space much, is a significant political entity in the outer spiral. Mara was quiet again. She picked up the crystal from where it sat on the table beside her documents, turned it in her hands. And the Quelly's Mining Cooperative, she said slowly, holds a labor contract on me. Yes. Which is also a legal document. Yes. She put the crystal down, so there's a conflict. Potentially, yes. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her before, not the practical curiosity, not the open warmth, something older and more careful, the expression of someone who has encountered the moment when circumstances stop being inconvenient and start being consequential. Okay, she said, tell me everything. The mining cooperative's communication arrived on the 9th day. It was not addressed to Mara. It was addressed to Quelly's 7-station authority, copied to Interstellar Transit Authority, with a reference number that flagged it for priority handling. I got access to it through a contact in the transit hub who handles documentation overflow and who owes me several favors. The cooperative's position was straightforward. Mara Callahan had signed a valid labor contract. She was now 9 days past her contracted start date. The cooperative was applying the financial penalties in the contract's delay clause, which were significant, and was requesting that station authority facilitate immediate transport of their contracted worker to Quelly's 4. Nothing in the message mentioned Vel. Nothing in the message mentioned anything about the behavioral developments of the past several days. I wondered briefly if they didn't know. Then the second communication arrived. This one was addressed to the Vethkari Collective's nearest diplomatic representation, which is a small station about 4 systems out, and this one mentioned Vel. It was from the cooperative's legal division. It was careful and technical, and it said, in the language that legal documents use when they want to sound calm while suggesting something alarming, that the cooperative was aware of the alleged Vethkari behavioral declaration regarding their contracted worker, that they did not recognize the legal validity of said declaration, as it applied to a human citizen under a valid contract, and that they were formally requesting clarification from appropriate authorities regarding resolution of the conflict. Gores brought me a copy of this one too. He sat in my booth and placed it on my desk and said, "This is going to get bigger." "How much bigger?" "Dren," he said, and paused and said it again. "This is a Vethkari claim. There are 3 of the collective's ships in the outer spiral right now. They monitor their own kind's declarations. They already know." I absorbed this, and the cooperative. The cooperative has contracts with the Dreth Trade Federation. The Dreth Trade Federation has ships in this sector too. He looked at me. "You understand what I'm saying?" I understood what he was saying. He was saying that a 19-year-old girl from Billings, Montana, was about to become the center of an interstellar incident, and the incident was going to arrive at Quelly's 7 in the form of ships. The 10th day was quiet in the particular way that precedes significant events. Mara knew most of it by then. Not everything. I didn't tell her about the incoming ships because I didn't have confirmed information yet, and I didn't want to alarm her without certainty. But she knew about the cooperative's communication. She knew about the legal conflict. She had contacted the Interstellar Human Affairs Office, which is a modestly staffed organization that handles advocacy for human citizens in non-human jurisdictions, and they had responded with something between concern and astonishment. She was remarkably calm. Not dismissive, she wasn't pretending it wasn't serious. She was calm in the way of someone who has decided that panic is not useful and is allocating their energy accordingly. She sat with her documents and her notebook, and she thought through the pieces carefully. She talked to Vel. That morning, he was present at the far end of the transit lounge when she arrived, and she went to where he was and sat down on the floor near him. She had started doing this, just sitting near him, the way she described sitting near a large animal that you have determined means you know peace, and she talked to him. She told him what was happening. She explained the labor contract. She explained the cooperative's claim. She explained that she didn't know exactly what his declaration meant or what he intended by it, but that she was grateful for it even if it complicated things. She said, "I need you to understand that I made a commitment before I came here. I signed a contract. Not because I had great options, I didn't, but because I needed to build something and the contract was a start. And I don't know how your world works, but in my world, you follow through on what you commit to, even when it's hard." She paused. "I'm not asking you to rescind it or whatever the right word is. I want you to know the whole picture." Vel was quiet for a long time. Then he made a sound she hadn't heard before. Not the acknowledgement sound, not the settled sound. Something longer and more complex, several registers woven together, and Mara said later that she didn't understand it but she felt it, somewhere central, like a statement she'd been given the meaning of without the words. She said, "Okay, I think I understood some of that." She put her hand on the floor between them, not toward him, not reaching for him, just placed it there, open. And after a long moment, one of Vel's secondary appendages unfolded from where it was tucked against his side and rested beside her hand. Not on it, beside it. Close. That's the part I come back to when I think about the whole thing, not what happened after, that part, the closing of distance. They came on the 11th day. Not literally an army, but that's what it felt like, and that's what the station called it afterward in the incident report, and honestly the designation feels accurate. 3 vessels, 2 from the Quelly's Mining Cooperative, a personnel transport and a security vessel, the latter carrying 8 Dreth contracted security officers, which is not an army by the standards of actual armies, but is a significant force for a way-station interaction. And 1 vessel from the Vethkari Collective's outer spiral monitoring presence, a collective ship, angular and dark, that doesn't look like much from the outside, and that every experienced being in the sector treats with the kind of respect you give to things you cannot calculate. They arrived within 2 hours of each other. I do not think this was coordinated. I think both parties had been moving and arrived at roughly the same time, because the physics of the sector worked out that way. The station went into what I can only describe as a collective-held breath. The cooperative's personnel were processed through arrival normally, and their legal representative, a Dreth named Hotz, 4'8" of extremely expensive suit and quiet fury, made directly for the station authorities' coordination office to file formal papers. The security team was held in the docking area pending station authority clearance for entry, which Gores managed deliberately slowly. The collective's vessel did not send a formal representative. What it sent was a single occupant, through a private access corridor, and that occupant went directly to the outer ring. To Vel's suite. We know this because the station's corridor sensors picked up the movement and Gores was monitoring everything by this point. The visitor was another Vethkari. Different from Vel, older perhaps, though it's difficult to say with certainty, and carrying the specific frequency markers that the collective uses to indicate diplomatic status. The meeting in Vel's suite lasted 40 minutes. 40 minutes. And then the collective's representative came back out of the outer ring, walked through the commercial district, every being clearing the path without being asked, and went to the station authorities' coordination office. where Hotz was already waiting. The meeting that followed lasted 3 hours. I do not have direct access to the content of that meeting. What I have is Gore's summary, which he gave me afterward with the slightly gray expression of someone who has witnessed too many layers of something at once. The short version: the cooperative's position was that their labor contract predated the Vethkari claim by 9 days, and that under Interstellar Transit Authority precedent, prior contracts hold when conflicting claims arise. The collective's position was that a Vethkari behavioral claim is not a contract and is not subject to precedent comparisons with contracts because it is a biological declaration of sovereign protective status, and that treating it as equivalent to a commercial contract was a category error that the collective would not accept as the basis for resolution. The subtext of the collective's position, which Gore said was present in the room like weather, was, "We are the Vethkari, and Vel has done something in 200 years of documentation that has never occurred before, and we will not have it resolved by a mining company's labor clause." The cooperative subtext, which was also present in the room, was, "We have Dreth Federation connections and a security team in the dock, and we are not leaving without our contracted worker." The actual human being at the center of all of this was sitting in the main transit lounge, reading a borrowed novel, with a piece of dark blue crystal on the table beside her, and a Vethkari who had quietly moved to occupy the far wall sometime in the early morning, and had not moved since. Nobody called Mara to the meeting. Nobody invited her. Nobody thought to ask her, because in the framing of everyone involved, the cooperative, the collective station authority, she was the subject of the meeting, not a participant. She walked in anyway. Gore's told me about this part, and his expression when he described it was complicated in a way that I think means he found it both alarming and, quietly, impressive. She had come to Station Authority's coordination office looking for me. I had told her I'd be in that area, and she came to find me. And she walked into the corridor outside the coordination office and heard multiple voices in multiple languages in a volume that suggested significant disagreement. And she stood outside for a moment, and then she opened the door and walked in. The room had Hotz and 2 cooperative attorneys, the Vethkari collective representative, 3 station authority officials including the chief coordinator, Gore's in his security capacity, 2 Quellic legal observers, and me, who had arrived about 20 minutes earlier and been allowed to stay because I speak all the relevant languages and the chief coordinator needed someone to help manage communication. Myra walked in and looked around at all of it. Hotz looked at her with an expression that combined professional assessment and the particular irritation of someone whose legal strategy depends on the subject remaining an abstraction. The collective representative looked at her with an expression I could not read. Mara looked at the chief coordinator. She had met him briefly on day 2 and said, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is about me. I'd like to be here." The chief coordinator looked at Hotz. Hotz looked at his attorneys. The attorneys made the micro-expressions of legal professionals recalculating. "Miss Callahan," Hotz said in human standard, "this is a legal proceeding. Your interests are being represented." "By who?" she asked, and not aggressively, genuinely curious. "Because I don't have an attorney and nobody told me this was happening." There was a pause. The chief coordinator said, "She has a point." He gestured to an empty seat. Mara sat down. She looked around the room again, taking stock of everything with those practical dark eyes, and then she looked at the collective representative. "You're from the Vethkari collective," she said. The representative, whose name was something in Vethkari vocal range that the station had transliterated as Velesrath, made a small movement of acknowledgement. "I want to understand what he declared," she said. "Vel, what the declaration means in your law and your culture, the actual meaning, not the legal translation." There was a pause of a different kind, not tension, consideration. Velesrath said, in a voice that had the same deep register as Vel's but shaped differently, shaped for communication with others. In our culture, the declaration does not have a direct translation into any other species framework. The closest approximation is, this being exists in a space I am responsible for. It is not ownership. It is not territory in the standard sense. It is a form of witness. We see you. We will not allow you to be erased. Myra was quiet for a moment. In my culture, she said, that would be called something between friendship and family, depending on how deep it goes. Velesrath was still. Yes, they said finally, depending on how deep it goes. Hotz cleared his throat. This is culturally interesting, but the legal fact remains. I signed the contract, Mara said. Everyone looked at her. I signed it. Nobody forced me. The terms were explained to me. I understood what I was committing to. She looked at Hotz. I'm not trying to get out of it. I'm trying to understand if there's a way to honor it that doesn't require ignoring everything that happened here. Hotz's expression was carefully neutral. The contract requires you to be present at the Quelly's 4 work site. The only resolution that satisfies the cooperative's interests is your transport. What are the penalty clauses if I don't go? Hotz named a number. It was significant. It was, in the context of a 19-year-old's financial situation, catastrophic. Myra nodded slowly. And the contract duration is 6 months. 6 standard month, yes. Renewable at mutual agreement. Yes. She was quiet again, thinking visibly the way she thought with her whole face, not hiding it. Can the cooperative relocate the work to Quelly's 7? She asked. I understand there are operations here, maintenance contracts, supply chain work. I'm contracted for surface operations support, which covers a range of functions. Hotz blinked. This was apparently not the direction he had expected. That would require a contract modification, which both parties would have to agree to. I know, she looked at him steadily. I'm asking if it's possible, not if it's your preference. One of the attorneys leaned over and murmured something to Hotz. Hotz was quiet for a moment. The chief coordinator looked like someone trying not to let their expression do anything specific. There is work here, Hotz said finally slowly. The station has supply contracts with the cooperative. It would require review. I'd like it reviewed, Mara said. I'd like to honor my contract. I'd like to do it somewhere that doesn't require. She paused, and for the first time her voice changed slightly, something underneath the practical composure, somewhere that doesn't require leaving something I don't think I should leave. She looked at Velesrath. The Vethkari collective representative looked back at her. The collective's position, Velesrath said, in a voice that was no longer addressing the room in general but addressing the cooperative's representative specifically, is that any resolution must be agreed to by all parties, including Miss Callahan. The collective does not compel. The declaration is not a cage, a pause. It is an acknowledgement. While all of this was happening in the coordination office, Vel was still in the transit lounge. He was not there when the meeting ended, 2 hours later. He was in the docking area. Specifically, he was standing in the corridor leading to the cooperative security vessel's docking bay, between the bay doors and the corridor junction, in a position that the 8 Dreth security officers inside the vessel would have to move past if they received orders to mobilize toward the commercial district. He was just standing there. Not threatening, not moving, not making sounds. Just present. All 8 Dreth security officers, Gores told me later, had declined to exit the vessel since becoming aware of what was in the corridor. I think about this sometimes when I think about how the situation resolved. I think about Mara in the coordination office, working through the problem with the careful, thorough practicality of someone who has learned to solve problems with what she has, trying to find the path that honors the commitment she made, and also honors the thing that had grown in 11 days in a way station at the edge of known space. And I think about Vel in the docking corridor, not issuing threats, not making demands, not doing anything that could be classified as hostile action under interstellar law. Just placing himself between the corridor and the ship. Just present. This being exists in a space I am responsible for. He wasn't being a predator. He wasn't being a weapon. He was being, for the first time in the documented history of his species, something that might be called loyal. Chapter 15, The Resolution. It took 4 more days. The cooperative's legal team conducted the contract review. Mara was right. There was work on Quelly 7 that fell within her contracted work category. The station's supply management operations were understaffed. The cooperative had a maintenance contract with station services that was underperforming, and surface operations support is a flexible enough designation to cover logistics coordination, inventory management, and supply chain documentation, which it turned out Mara was quite good at. Gores described watching her work through the logistics backlog in the cooperative station files as watching someone who understands how things actually work on things, which is high praise from a Dreth. The contract modification was negotiated over 3 days and signed on the 4th. Mara Callahan would complete her 6-month labor contract at Quelly 7 in the Cooperative Station Services Division at the original contracted rate with a location differential included. The location differential was a point of contention, but the collective's representatives' continued presence at the negotiating table had a certain clarifying effect on HOTS's flexibility. The collective's vessel departed after the signing. The cooperative's vessels departed 2 hours after that. The Dreth security team left without exiting their vessel. Gores told me about this with something that looked like satisfaction. Mara started her work at the Station Services Division on the day after the contract was signed. She was good at it. Better than good, she had an instinct for the systems that the previous staff had not had, an ability to see where the flow was interrupted and fix it. And within the first month, the division's performance metrics had improved enough that the cooperative's regional manager sent a communication that Mara described to me as surprised, and slightly annoyed that they were surprised. She stayed in the transit lounge at the end of each work shift, in the section near the wall, and Vel was there most evenings. Not always, he came and went as Vethkari do, on no schedule anyone else could track, but often enough that the transit lounge staff had quietly adjusted the ambient lighting in that section to include frequencies that worked better for Vethkari visual processing, and nobody discussed this adjustment explicitly, but everyone understood it. They talked, or rather, she talked and he listened, and sometimes he made sounds that she had learned gradually to parse. Not language in any form that translates directly, but communication. The space between them filling with something that didn't need translation, because it existed below the level where translation operates. She showed him things. Photographs on her comm device, Montana, the grasslands, the family land, the mountains. She described them to him, and he looked at the images in the way that something with different visual processing looks at images, not seeing what she saw but attending to what she showed him, and sometimes he would make a sound at a specific image, and she would look at it again and try to see what he was hearing in it. She learned to hear the difference between his sound types, which ones were acknowledgement, which were something closer to question, which were the settled sound of simple presence. She kept the crystal on her workstation. I talked to her about it once, the whole thing, all of it, the strangeness and the weight of it. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "You know what I think it is? I think I talked to him because it would have been rude not to, and I think he started paying attention because nobody had ever done that before, just treated him like he was worth addressing." She paused. "I think loneliness in something that apex must be the heaviest thing in the universe, because nothing comes near you, everything leaves. You could go your whole life without anyone ever just." She stopped, looking for the word. "Staying," I said. Yeah, she said, staying. Chapter 17, the last part, what I want you to take from this. I've been in this work for 6 years, documentation, translation. The paperwork of a universe that contains more species than any census has successfully counted, each with their own law and language and history, and the particular way they construct the category of other. I have never seen anything like what I watched over 11 days at Quelly's 7. I have thought about it constantly since. The behavioral literature on Vethkari has been updated twice in the 18 months since, and both updates reference the Quelly's 7 incident, and both updates are carefully scientific and appropriately qualified, and neither one manages to capture the thing I actually witnessed. Which is this: the most dangerous predator in the known outer spiral, a creature that has spent its entire existence outside the gravitational pull of attachment, that has never in 200 years of documentation been observed forming a bond with anything, encountered a human being who was scared and stubborn and broke and lost, and who, despite all of that, refused to perform the fear that the universe had built into everything else that came near that creature. She talked to him about Moss, about Montana, about the sky in September. And he heard something in it that 9 years of apex solitude had made him capable of recognizing for the first time, the sound of someone who was not leaving. The army came, the ships came, the lawyers came. And none of them, with all their force and law and precedent, could move a girl who had decided, with the same practical certainty she brought to everything else, that she was not leaving either. I asked her once, toward the end of the 11 days, whether she was afraid. She thought about it. Yeah, she said, but I was afraid in Montana too. I was afraid when I signed the contract. I was afraid when I got off the shuttle and couldn't read any of the signs. She shrugged. I don't think being afraid is the same as being in danger, and I don't think being the biggest thing in the room is the same as being safe. She picked up the crystal, turned it. He was lonely, she said. I could tell, and I know what lonely feels like, so I stayed. That's it, that's the whole story. A human girl stayed when everything in the universe was calibrated to make her leave. And the galaxy's deadliest predator, for the first time in its ancient and solitary history, was not alone.